Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel, or welcome to my channel. If you are new here, I hope you're all doing so well. Welcome back to another true crime and makeup episode. Today we are covering the case of Dean Corll, the Candyman killer, the Houston mass murderer, the epitome of evil, the absolute asshole that he is. I hate this guy so much, makes my blood boil. And to make it worse, he had two accomplices who were very much enjoying the murder spree that they went on with Dean Corll. And listen, we all know that you don't talk to strangers anyway, but Dean Corll is exactly why I will never ever accept candy off a man that gets called the Candyman. It's given pedo. As per the last video, I am not going to give any spoilers away in the summary. This should be a bit of a longer video. Just an FYI, I do go through all of the victims' names and the dates that they have been abducted, just because it's very important for me to cover each and every victim. So I'm sorry if one point it feels like you're getting names and dates thrown at you, but it's so important to this case. Now, before we jump in, please make sure that you are subscribed to my channel. Put the notification bell on so you don't miss when I upload, because that is every Wednesday and Sunday at 7:30 p.m. British Standard Time. On here we do true crime, we do haunting or homicide, and we also do homicidal history, which is like one of my faves to do. We've got a whole collection of things that we do over here, so hit the button. If you're wondering why I do true crime and makeup at the same time, makeup is my fidget spinner. It stops me being anxious. It stops me getting a bit emotional. I kind of need it to get through the stories, to be honest. So if you're here simply for the true crime aspect, that's fine. Turn your phone upside down and just listen to me chat away. I am in the process of trying to set up a podcast. Subscribe and look out for that if that's something that you would prefer. I will let you know once it's up and running. But without any further rambling or any further ado, let's get into the case of Dean Corll, the Candyman killer. I don't know why my hair, like I've curled it and it's kind of given like Lord Farquaad at the front. Let's just ignore that. So Dean Arnold Corll, I'm going to have to say his name like Corll, because Corll, us Scottish people, we can't do it right, so Corll. He was born on December the 24th, literally my favourite day of the year. Why? Of 1939, and he was born in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Now, he would be the first child to Mary Emma Robinson and Arnold Edwin Corll. And honestly, like, whilst Corll's childhood is very far from ideal, because he did have a few things that went on that, you know, is unfortunate, unlike a lot of other serial killers, he never had like this really traumatic event that might trigger a killer. Like, his dad was pretty strict, very strict, but he was like in no way abusive to his children. Like, he adored his children. He just wanted what was best for them. And his dad being strict was really just him having certain rules in place that he didn't want to be broken, which is understandable. Like, I wasn't allowed out my front garden gate until I was like 12. I followed that. And Corll's mother, she was extremely protective of her boys. Like, she loved and adored them. She just wanted to make sure they were safe at all times. Compared to a lot of people that we've spoken about before, and even like people that I know in real life, Dean Corll has quite an easy childhood in comparison. Now, I will say Mary and Arnold's marriage, it was far from perfect. They did argue quite a lot. They never really saw eye to eye, but they really did love each other, and they made their children aware of the fact that whilst mummy and daddy might argue sometimes, they really love each other and they really love their children as well. The couple, they worked really hard to sort out their differences, but ultimately it just wasn't meant to be. So they did wind up divorcing in 1946, and this was just 4 years after the birth of their youngest son, Stanley. Now, let me say that I know a divorce is such a hard thing to go through for a family, especially the way it affects the children. Children can blame themselves. It can be a really dark period of time, but the way Corll's parents handled it, they really ensured that their children's best interests were at heart for both of them, and they were very amicable for the sake of their children. And I know I have a lot of friends whose parents are divorced, and believe me, they've never became a serial killer, or no that I know of. So whilst this divorce is really hard on Mary and Arnold and the children, when Arnold was drafted into the US Air Force, it was really important for both parents to ensure that Arnold still had contact with his sons. And it was really important for Mary that Arnold still got to see his children and that her children still got to see their dad. And she actually relocated so this could happen. Mary and the children, they relocated to like a trailer park in Memphis, Tennessee, and they had actually sold their family home just so they could be close to Arnold. And as I said previously, Mary and Arnold, their number one priority were their children, and they ensured that every single day they knew they were loved, they knew that they were cherished, and they knew that the divorce and the split had nothing to do with them. It was just mum and dad couldn't work out their differences, but they loved them all the same. So I guess we need to get back to the idiot of today's case, Dean Corll. So as a child, Dean was known to be very shy, very serious. He didn't really interact or socialise with other children. And despite this, despite his lack of socialisation, he would show a great deal of empathy for others. He really seemed to care about others, what happened to them. It really bothered him. He had a great deal of empathy. Which, I'm struggling to believe that considering the monster he came to be. But yeah, I don't know. Now, Corll, however, he did really struggle with rejection of any form, no matter how big or how small. This was something that would really affect him. In high school, he found it quite difficult because he was unable to participate in any sort of physical education because he had a heart murmur, and then the doctors had also discovered that he had a case of untreated rheumatic fever. And because he wasn't able to participate in the daily activities that every other child could, he almost seen this as a form of rejection from his own body. And yet, that's going to have a psychological effect, but it's not going to make a killer. So in 1950, Mary and Arnold, they really tried to reconcile, and they even got remarried. They moved to Pasadena, Texas, and they were willing to really work at their marriage. And they tried really hard, right? They got remarried in 1950 and they were together until 1953. But ultimately, the problems that they had before, they never went away. And they just couldn't seem to work by it. So they end up splitting up, and Mary, she retains custody of all the children as she did prior. And yet again, although, divorce is a really tough thing to go through, they still remained amicable yet again, and both sons were in contact with their father whenever they wanted to be, and they were allowed to go and visit him whenever they wanted to. So after the divorce, Mary decides that she would like to go do a bit of travelling, and I was like, how cute, maybe travel to Bali, eat, pray, love, a wee bit for yourself, Mary, good on you. But she just went travelling around the south, and when she was travelling around the south, she would meet a travelling salesman. Now, the travelling salesman that she met was a man by the name of Jake West, and they hit it off right away. Love at first sight, instant connection, they really had that spark, and they wound up getting married. So Mary, Jake, and her two boys, they wind up moving to, is it Vidor? I don't know. In Texas. And it would be in Texas where the boys would get a half-sister, Joyce Janine. So Mary and Jake, they're like, we've got this family, we've got 3 children that we need to provide for, and they get a bit of the entrepreneurial spirit. They decide that they are going to start their own candy company. So they start a candy company in their garage, and they call this a Pekin Prince. Now, Dean Corll and Stanley Corll, they would work in this, garage candy shop day and night. Even whilst they were in school, they were, working in the morning, going to school, coming home, working in the factory throughout the night, going to school, crazy hours. They were in charge of the candy making machines, and then also packing up the candy so Jake could sell it on his travel routes. So Dean Corll, he would attend Vidor High School in Texas, and he was described as being pretty well behaved. His grades were fine, he wasn't a genius by any means, but he certainly got by. His grades were good enough that the teachers weren't having a go at him, but they were also like average enough that the teachers weren't praising him either. Now, Corll, he was a bit of a musician. He was in the school's brass band and he played trombone. And it's said that this was something he was really, really passionate about. Like, he absolutely loved it. And like, we love a musical king. And despite being, you know, a bit of a loner in high school because he didn't really like to socially interact, he did manage to bag himself a few girlfriends. I don't know if they like the mysterious silent type or if his aftershave just smelled really nice. But yeah, quite a few girlfriends through high school. So Corll, he would graduate from Vidor High School in 1958 and the family, they decided to move to the northern outskirts of Houston. Now, the reason that they decided to make this move was so the family would be closer to the city, and this was really good for the candy company because most of their customers came from the city. So if they're closer, people could just come pick up what they want. They wouldn't have to wait on Jake going on the travelling sales route to obtain their sweet treat. So in 1960, Mary, she asks Dean Corll if he would move in with his widowed grandmother in Yoder of Indiana. And the reason for this was just to help look after her. I mean, I think she had kind of relied heavily on her husband, and then when he passed away, she needed a bit more assistance. And Dean Corll had agreed to do this. He said that he would move into her home in Yoder, Indiana, and help look after her. And honestly, this seemed to work in Corll's favour because he would start dating a girl and they would date until 1962, where she would propose to him. Love that, queen behaviour. But she proposed to him, but Corll rejected the proposal. So at some point in 1962, Corll decides that he's going to move back to the area of Houston Heights. And this was so he could help out at the candy shop, you know, make a living. And he wound up getting his own apartment that sat right above the shop. And then in 1963, Mary and Jake West, they would wind up being divorced. And Mary kind of thought to herself, you know, I would like to have my own business venture, so I'm going to start my own candy company. The drama. So her candy business was called Corll Candy Company, and Dean Corll himself, he would be sort of appointed as the vice president, and his younger brother Stanley would be the secretary treasurer. Now, the same year that the Corll Candy Company opened and was in motion, a teenage employee of the company had went directly to Mary and complained about Dean Corll. He said that Dean Corll was making very, very inappropriate sexual advances toward him. A teenager, bear in mind, a teenager, and he was kind of, you know, sexually harassing him. So Mary hears this and, you know, she's like shocked and horrified, and she's like, oh my God, I need to do something about this. So she fires the teenager. She fired the teenager for speaking up. Instead of telling Dean, don't be a pedo, she fired the teenager who was the victim. So I'm sorry, Mary, but you're enabling him to do what he's doing. So Dean Corll, he would be drafted into the army in 1964, and he would serve for around 10 months before he applied for a hardship discharge. He had explained that he really needed to be home helping his mother run the family business. He said that she was really struggling to do it all by herself. And the army actually granted him an honourable discharge on June 11th of 1965. Now, from the army, Corll had been harbouring a bit of a secret, and he has loose lips one night and he tells some of his acquaintances that whilst he was in the army, he realised that he was a homosexual. He realised he was gay. Slay King, love that. And he even confided in people and told them that he had experienced his first homosexual experience whilst in the army. Now, people noticed when Corll had come from... My God, I can't talk! When Corll had come home from the army, his behaviour and his mannerisms around teenage boys especially had completely changed. He was acting like a weirdo. And also, once Corll had returned to the family business, you know, the Corll Candy Company as vice president, drama starts popping off in Candyland, right? And the competition between Corll Candy Company and the Pekin Prince, his ex-stepfather's company, was popping off. Like, the tea was hot. Hashtag family feud. Now, because of the candy chaos, Corll decided that he was going to work all hours that he possibly could, just like when he was in high school, because he was like, no way is my stepfather's business going to take over the Corll Candy Company. Like, Pekin Prince who? He did not want their company being outshined. So in 1965, the Corll Candy Company, they decide that they need a change of scenery, a change of area. So they relocated to 22nd Street, and their shop was now like parallel to Helms Elementary School. Now, Corll, he was known to provide free candy to teenage boys. Yeah, teenage boys within this school. And ultimately, they all sort of, got to know him. They thought he was just a really nice guy. And they ended up calling him the Candy Man. Like, I'm sorry, but if you're getting called the Candy Man, that is not a good thing. You're spending far too much time around those children, sir, and I'm going to have to ask you to back up just a bit. So, Corll Candy Company, they decide that they need some workers in because things are really busying up, which is great for them, but how do you keep up with business if you've not got enough employees? So Dean Corll is like, I know the perfect group that we want to employ. They're going to be amazing. They're going to get the job done. We should employ a group of teenage boys. Like, why, Dean? Like, let's be honest, like, why, Now, Corll, he wanted to seem like he was like this cool kind of boss, and he decided to install a pool table at the rear of the factory, and this is where the young teenage boys and Corll could hang out on breaks, get to know each other, play a bit of pool with each other. It is literally giving John Wayne Gacy to a T. And I feel like there's a lot of similarities between Corll and John Wayne Gacy in terms of their victims, especially. Oh, get chills. I know the good ones like Danny Zuko. So, in 1967, Dean Corll decided that he was going to groom a 12-year-old 6th grade student by the name of David Owen Brooks. Now, David Brooks, he had been one of the children that Corll was constantly handing out candy to, so Brooks felt like he had developed quite a nice relationship with Corll. So Brooks had started to socialise with Corll and then also the other teenage boys at the rear of the factory, like when they were playing pool. And he would also go on regular trips to South Texas beaches, again with this group of teenagers and Dean Corll. Now, David Brooks, he had glasses and he found that this made him a very easy target for bullies. He would be bullied pretty badly at school and he felt like he was a complete outcast. They would always make fun of his appearance, and disturbingly, it wasn't just children that would bully David, it was adults as well. And he really started to lean on Dean Corll because Dean Corll was the first adult or person in general that he had met that didn't make fun of his appearance. So at this point, David Brooks is really relying on Dean Corll for every aspect of his life. He really counts as him. He looks up at him almost like a father figure. And if he ever needed money, he knew he could go to Corll, and he knew that he could approach Corll for almost anything in his life. And as I've said, this young 12-year-old boy, he really looks at Corll as a father figure. He really trusts him fully, and disturbingly, Corll would abuse this trust in the worst way. So Corll had started up a sexual relationship with David Brooks after this period of grooming. He would pay David Brooks in cash and in gifts if David Brooks would allow Corll to perform fellatio on him. We know what fellatio is, right? We're all adults here, or at least we should be. Now, David Brooks, he would go on to drop out of high school when he was just 15 years old, and he was very much still involved with Dean Corll. And he thought, I can drop out of school because Dean's going to be by my side, so I'm going to be just fine. Now, it was also around this time that Dean Corll's mother and his younger sister, they had moved to Colorado, and they had wound up shutting down Corll Candy Company. So at this point, Corll is feeling very lost after the closure of the candy company. Like, this is all he's ever known, it's all he's ever did, and he's kind of trying to figure out his purpose again. And the thing is having this candy company and being around these teenagers, that was what was allowing him to satisfy his depraved urges. So Dean Corll decides he needs some kind of job to keep him busy and keep him living a somewhat normal life, or at least appear to. So he would get a job as an electrician, and this would end up being his employment up until the day that he died. Now, shockingly, Brooks, who had been groomed by Corll, he would actually go on to be one of his accomplices during his horrific murder spree. This would be alongside another teenage accomplice, Elmer Wayne Henley. Now, some of the teenage boys that they would bring to Dean Corll for his sick, depraved, murderous acts would actually be some of their own friends. That honestly just baffles me. They would bring some of their own friends to someone that they know is going to torture and abuse them in the worst way possible and then murder them. Now, other victims would be some people that Corll had befriended himself and decided to bring back and kill for his own sadistic pleasure, and 2 others would actually have been employees from the Corll Candy Company. So Corll, he was able to lure his victims into his vehicle by promising these young teenagers that he would take them to a party or he would give them a ride to wherever it was that they were headed. But he would ultimately drive them back to his own home. He would entice them inside, and then once they were inside, he would ply them with like drugs and alcohol, and he would do this in the hopes that the teenagers would pass out and he could do whatever he wanted to them. Now, these young boys, they would be stripped naked and they would either be tied to Corll's bed or to a plywood torture board that he would have hung on his walls. And these victims would be brutally beaten, brutally sexually assaulted, and they would be so brutally tortured. And sometimes Corll, he would drag this out for days on end just for his own sick pleasure. And to kill the young men, he would either shoot them or strangle them to death. With these boys' dead bodies, Corll would tie them up in a plastic sheet and he would either hide them in a boat shed in southwest Houston, on a beach in Bolivar Peninsula, or Jefferson County, where he would bury them in woodland that was near to Lake Sam Rayburn. And what's just so sick is there would be several occasions where Corll would force his victims to either write a letter home or even call their families to tell them why they were absent, why they've kind of just went missing, because he thought this would buy him more time and that the families would just think that their children have moved out and ran away. Now, Corll, he would often keep the keys that his victims had, so like house keys, car keys, whatever they had on them at the time. And during his mass killing spree, Corll would play like musical houses, like he moved about so much. So on September the 25th of 1970, an 18-year-old college student by the name of Jeffrey Conan, he would vanish after hitchhiking from the University of Texas back to his parents' home. So at the time where Jeffrey is hitchhiking, there was also another student who was hitchhiking with him, but they would be dropped off around 6:15 p.m. and they were dropped off at the corner of South Vosh Road and also Westheimer Road. Now, this had been near the uptown area of Houston, so Jeffrey himself, he still had quite a bit to go before he would be home. Now, not too long after this first initial murder, Brooks had actually walked in on Dean Corll with 2 teenage boys tied to a 4-poster bed. Obviously at this point, David Brooks, he is freaking out because he has no idea what's actually going on here. And Dean Corll, he buys Brooks's silence with a $200 Chevy Corvette. Dean Corll would later tell him that he did in fact murder the 2 teenage boys. And it would be around this time that Brooks would start luring boys for Dean Corll because his silence had been bought with a $200 car. But it would be December the 13th of 1970 when Brooks would lure 2 teenage boys to Dean Corll's apartment. These boys were 14 years old, and that was James Glass and Danny Yates. Both of these 14-year-old boys were tied to torture boards. They were raped, they were tortured, and they were strangled to death and then buried in the boat shed. And what's just absolutely horrific about this is that James Glass was a friend of David Brooks. David Brooks, who lured him to his death. And just 6 weeks after this, there would be two brothers by the name of Donald and Jerry Waldrop. Now, Donald was 15 and Jerry was 13, and they would encounter both Brooks and Corll, who were basically out prowling for their next victim. Both of these young boys would be lured into Dean Corll's van. They would be taken back to his apartment and they would be raped, tortured and strangled to death. And both of these young boys, just like James Glass and Danny Yates, they would be buried in the boat shed. Now, between March and May of 1971, there would be 3 more victims. So we've got Randall Harvey, who was 15 years old. He would last be seen by his parents on March the 9th. Then we have David Hillegeist, who was only 13 years old, and Gregory Malley Winkle, who was 16 years old. Both of these young boys would be abducted at the same time on May the 29th. Now, both would be killed at an apartment that Corll had been renting on West 11th Street, and Brooks was known to have participated in both of these murders. Now, Elmer Wayne Henley, he was friends with David, who had went missing, and because he was friends with David, for David's parents, he decided that he would go around with missing posters and put them around the town to try and help find him. But don't think too highly of Elmer Henley just yet, because we're going to get into it. So on August the 17th of 1971, there would be an acquaintance again of Brooks. This was 17-year-old Reuben Watson Haney, and he had been walking to a movie theatre when Brooks approached him. Brooks had said to Haney, my friend Dean Corll, he's having a party and you're invited. You should totally come along. It's going to be really good. We're going to drink, bit of drugs, it's going to be a laugh, it's going to be wild. And unfortunately, Reuben, he would agree to go with Brooks to Corll's address, and when he arrived there, he would be strangled to death and then buried in the boat shed. This young boy is just walking to the cinema to see a movie and his life is ended. And then in September of 1971, Corll would participate in musical houses again, and he would move to an apartment on Columbia Street. And whilst he was here, Brooks and Corll, they would murder 2 more youths. So in the winter of 1971, David Brooks would meet Elmer Henley. Now, he would introduce Elmer Henley to Dean Corll, and initially, Henley was meant to be a victim of Brooks and Corll. However, Corll had decided that Elmer Henley himself would be a very, very good accomplice, and he would offer Henley $200 for any boy that he could lure to Dean Corll. Now, Corll had told Henley that he was involved in like a slave ring, and this is why he needed to lure in young boys. As if that made it any better and any more likely that someone would want to help. But Elmer Henley would at some point. We'll get there. So in early 1972, Henley decided to accept Corll's offer of $200 for every young boy that he could lure to Corll's apartment to be murdered. Now, Henley, he claimed that the only reason he did this was due to financial difficulty that his family was facing, and he was trying to help out with that. Now, Henley said that he would first participate in an abduction when Corll had moved to Schuyler Street. Henley had lured a victim to Corll's apartment, and they had tricked this young boy into putting on handcuffs, which again just makes me think John Wayne Gacy, because this is what he did. Corll would then blindfold him and gag him. Henley said that he would then leave Corll with the youth to do whatever he was going to do with them, which of course is murder. And I just don't know if I believe for a second that he thought Corll wasn't going to kill him. It just doesn't really make sense to me. I don't buy it. But unfortunately, the identity of this victim remains unknown. So then on March 24th of 1972, Corll, Henley and Brooks, they would abduct an acquaintance of Henley's, and this was Frank Aguirre. Now, they all went back to Corll's home in Rambler, where they were going to be drinking, they were going to be smoking marijuana. I can never say marijuana, like marijuana, weed. They were going to smoke weed. Now, Henley claimed yet again that he didn't know Corll's intentions with Frank. And he also said that he would later try and persuade Corll not to kill Frank. But ultimately, Frank would be raped, tortured and strangled to death. And I'm sorry, but I just do not buy it that Henley did not know what was going to happen to his friend. And then on April the 20th, Corll, Brooke and Henley, they would abduct yet again another teenage boy. This was 17-year-old Mark Scott, and it would be Corll who would initiate this abduction. Now, Corll had claimed that Mark had cheated on a deal regarding stolen property, and apparently this warrants him needing to die. Mark was grabbed by force and he fought and he tried his best to get away from the three of them. But when he realised that Corll was pointing a gun at him, he had to comply, or at least he felt he had to comply. He thought this was the best chance he had to survive. Mark was tied to the torture board where he would have to suffer through torture, rape, brutal abuse before being strangled to death. Mark's body was then buried at High Island Beach. And Brooks had later stated just how sadistic Henley was. He had said that Henley was fascinated with how much stamina people had, especially when they were fighting for their lives. And he would just be fascinated and would enjoy watching them fight and fight and fight until they would eventually die. And before Corll had left the address of Schuler Street, the three of them would go on to kill two other youths. So first we have Billy Balch and also Johnny DeLome. Both Billy and Johnny, they would be tied to Corll's bed where they were both raped and tortured. And Henley, he started to strangle Billy and then he turned around and shouted, "Hey Johnny," to get his attention before then proceeding to shoot Johnny in the forehead. It said that the bullet that went through Johnny's head came out his ear and he was still alive, and Henley proceeded to strangle both Johnny and Billy to death. Both of them would be buried at High Island Beach. Everything about this case makes me absolutely sick to my stomach, but it's the fact as well that Henley, especially apparently according to Brooks, seems to enjoy watching these young boys fight for their life and try and fight through the torture and abuse and do anything that they can to survive, and they actually enjoy watching it. So the trio, they had lured another young man into the home, and this was 19-year-old William Ridinger. Devastatingly, William would be tied to the plywood torture board. He would be raped and tortured and abused in the most horrific way. But he would be let go at the request of Brooks. So this young boy is let go because Brooks had requested it. Henley proceeds to knock Brooks unconscious, and then Corll ties Brooks to his bed and starts assaulting him instead. I think just to teach him a lesson that, like, don't interfere with what I'm doing. But again, despite this assault that Corll and Henley have committed on Brooks, Brooks continued to work with Corll and with Henley. So Corll moves again, so he leaves Schuler Street and then moves to an apartment at Westcott Towers, and during the summer of 1972, they would kill another two victims. So the first victim was 17-year-old Stephen Sickman, and he had last been seen leaving a party in the Heights, and this was just before midnight on the 19th of July. He would be bludgeoned to the chest before being strangled to death and then buried in the boat shed. And then on August the 21st, 19-year-old Rob Bunton, he would be abducted on his way to work. And Roy, he would be shot twice in the head, and then he would be buried in the boat shed as well. And then on October the 3rd of 1972, Brooks and Henley, they would entice two young boys into Brooks's Corvette. This was Jay Simoneau and Richard Hembry. So once the two young boys were in the Corvette, they were then driven to Corll's apartment. And what is just absolutely horrendous is that very night, Jay Simoneau, he was forced to call his parents, where all they would hear is the word "mama" be shouted down the phone before the line was disconnected. The next morning, Hembry, he would be shot in the mouth by Henley, and then both boys were strangled to death. Both of these young boys, they would be buried in the boat shed just above Danny Yates and James Glass. Also, I just really want to apologise because I know I'm throwing a lot of names and dates at you, but it's really important to me that I cover every single victim of Corll's because they all deserve to be remembered, and I don't want to just skim through and say, you know, he had X amount of victims without giving you their names and letting you know who they are. That's really important to me, but I do understand it as a lot of information to take in all at once. So in November of 1972, an 18-year-old teenage boy by the name of Willard Branch, he would disappear whilst he had been hitchhiking. He was sort of hitchhiking local to the area, and devastatingly, his gagged and castrated body would be buried in the boat shed, and it's just awful to think the pain and torture that he has quite clearly endured being castrated. And then on November the 11th, a 19-year-old by the name of Richard Kepner, he disappeared whilst walking to a phone booth. Walk into a phone booth. Like, we've had someone who's just walked into a movie theatre, walk into a phone booth, just doing day-to-day activities. They're like, they should not be in danger at these points, but they are. Now, Richard Kepner, he would be strangled to death and also buried on High Island Beach. Now, altogether, there would be 10 teenage boys aged between 13 to 19 that would be murdered between March and November of 1972. 5 of these boys would be buried at High Island Beach, and another 5 would have been buried in the boat shed. So on January the 20th of 1973, yet again, Corll is playing musical houses, and he moves to Wirt Road, which is in the Spring branch of Houston. Now, within just 2 weeks of moving there, he would murder 17-year-old Joseph Lyles. Now, Corll, he was there for a very short period of time, and on March the 1st, he vacated the premises. He would then reside in an apartment in South Post Oak Road before then moving again to 2020 Lamar Drive, Pasadena. Like, this guy, the homes are like on rotation. He's got so many homes in his roster. So between February the 1st and June the 4th of 1973, Corll would suffer from hydrocele, which is basically like an accumulation of fluid around the testicle. Karma. Now, luckily for the public at this point, he would have to have a break in his horrific killing spree to recuperate, because he's not so tough now when he's feeling like a wee bit of pain. And can I just state, I hope whatever he was going through, I hope he was in a mass amount of pain and suffering. It'll never be as much as his victims suffered, but my God, I hope he was in agony. Now, Henley at this point, he's moved to Mount Pleasant, and he tries to claim this was because he wanted to distance himself from Corll. But like, I'm having trouble believing that, because he's sadistic as well. In some instances was a victim of Corll's, but ultimately, he was a cold-blooded accomplice as well. He enjoyed what he was doing. But devastatingly, when June did roll around, Corll almost felt like he was making up for lost time. It said that during the point when he could not commit his crimes, he was incredibly restless, he was agitated, he was almost described as an addict who has had to go cold turkey. And he would begin another mass killing spree. So on June the 4th, Corll and Henley, they got back to work and they would abduct a 15-year-old. Now, this 15-year-old was William Ray Lawrence, and this boy would endure 3 days of torture before then being strangled to death and buried at Lake Sam Rayburn. Just 2 weeks later, another young boy would be killed. 20-year-old Raymond Stanley Blackburn, he would be abducted, strangled, and buried at the same lake. Do you see what I mean when I say that makeup keeps me occupied whilst I'm doing true crime and makeup? Like, I can kind of hold back the emotion that I feel, and then when I've not got anything distracting me, it's really hard to get through. So when I say makeup's my fidget spinner, I literally mean it. So on July the 6th of 1973, Henley had started attending classes at Coach's Driving School. Now, this was in Bel Air, and this is where he would meet Homer Luis Garcia. Now, the next day, Homer calls home to his mother and says that, you know, he's made a friend and he's going to stay the night at his friend's house, and he would get in contact with her as soon as he could. Obviously, she's not going to be worried. He's with a friend, and that's fine. He can stay over and, you know, just let her know when he's going to be home. But Homer would never come home. He would be shot and left to bleed to death in Corll's bathtub. He would then be buried at the same lake as the two prior. Then on July the 12th, 17-year-old John Sellers, he would be bound, tortured and shot to death, and then his body would be buried at High Island Beach. I don't know how I managed to time it so bad, but my makeup's complete and the story is not, so I'm just going to keep telling you the case. Just me to you, not doing the makeup, just chatting away. So at the time of July, Brooks, he was married to his now pregnant fiancée, which is just crazy to me to even think about someone like that in a relationship and also having a baby when they're evil. Now this meant that for a period of time that Henley would be Corll's only assistant. Now, Corll and Henley, they would abduct and murder 15-year-old Michael Balch. And what I find so heartbreaking about this is the fact that Michael Balch was the brother of Billy Balch, who had also died at the hands of Corll, Brooks and Henley. Could you imagine being a parent and learning that two of your sons died in the most horrific way? It's so unfair. Like, how can two of these losses happen to one family? And there would be two other victims as well, and that would be Charles Cobble and Marty Ray Jones. And it would be August the 3rd of 1973 when Dean Corll would capture and murder his final victim, and it would be a 13-year-old boy from South Houston. This 13-year-old boy was James Stanton Dramala. James would be abducted whilst he was out riding his bike. This little boy just out having fun riding his bike around the streets that he believes is safe. And he would be abducted and murdered by these evil, evil monsters. Now Corll would take him to his home. He would be tied to the torture board where he proceeded to rape, torture and murder James. Now let's just get one thing straight, okay, because Henley really tries to act as though he was an unwilling victim and participant in Corll's heinous crimes, but he's equally as culpable in my book. He was enjoying this, he was having fun, he was sadistic and gained pleasure from other people's torture and other people begging for their life. He drew pleasure from. Now, as you can imagine, being friends with a killer like Corll is probably quite risky. I mean, after all, Henley was supposed to be a victim of Corll's, but because Corll decided he would make a good accomplice, he was spared. But it wouldn't be too long before Corll would turn on Henley. So on August the 8th of 1973, Henley lures two teenagers to Corll's apartment. Now, this is Rhonda Williams and Tim Kerley. Now, Rhonda would be the only known female victim to be lured to Corll's apartment. You know, like, Corll's only into teenage boys. Now, Henley, he would later say that he had no intentions whatsoever of murdering either Rhonda or Tim. Do I believe it? No. Apparently they were just there to party and have a good time, but again, I'm having trouble believing that. So this night, Rhonda, Tim and Henley, they are drinking quite heavy, they are partying, and they also sniff paint to get high. And like low-key, I think I've accidentally done that one time, because one time I was painting my nails and I was like really close to my nails. The fumes were crazy, and I swear the fumes went to my head and I was like, did I just get myself high on nail polish fumes? So anyway, they all drink, they get high, they fall asleep. Now Henley, he wakes up and he is shocked to find that he has been tied up alongside Tim and alongside Rhonda. Now Corll, he was screaming frantically and waving his .22 caliber pistol around at Henley, and he was screaming, "I'm going to kill you, but first I'm going to have my fun." We all know what his fun is, okay? I'm not going to say it, but we know. So Henley's tied up and Corll kind of like lifts him up and like carries him into the kitchen just so he can tell him off and tell him how fuming he is that Henley brought a female back to his apartment. He's like, that's not the aim of our game here. I only want teenage boys. Why would you bring back a female? Now, Henley, he begs and pleads with Corll to let him go. And he said if Corll lets him go, then he will participate in the murder of Rhonda and Tim. Now, Corll, he's no the sharpest tool in the toolbox. He's no the sharpest knife in the drawer. He's a sandwich short of a picnic. And he believes this. So he unties Henley and they take Rhonda and Tim into the bedroom. And when they're taking them into the bedroom, this is so they could be tied up to the torture board on the wall. Now, to tie Rhonda and Tim to the torture board, obviously Corll has to put down the gun. Now, when he puts down the gun, Henley goes ahead and grabs it. Now, Rhonda had said that it was quite evident that Corll's behaviour had completely shaken Henley. Yes, it has shaken Henley because Henley believes that he's now going to be a victim and that he's going to die, and he doesn't want that. But he was never shaken at Dean Corll's behaviour until he felt like he was in danger. But I'm just going to read a quote from Rhonda about like what she said about this situation. So she said, "He stood at my feet and just all of a sudden told Dean this couldn't keep going on. He couldn't let him keep killing his friends and that it had to stop." Now, Rhonda had also said Dean looked up and he was surprised. So he started getting up and he was like, "You're not going to do anything to me." Now, Henley, at this point, he says absolutely nothing, but just proceeds to shoot Corll 6 times. And this would put an end to Corll's vicious and heinous murder spree. So after killing Corll, Henley, he picks up the phone and calls the police and he says, "Y'all better get here right now, I've just killed a man." Like he's trying to be this knight in shining armour, like I've just put the end to a serial killer. But it's not quite true because he told Tim Corll, "If you wasn't my friend, I could have got $200 for you." Now, Henley and Brooks, they would be compliant with the police. They sort of described their involvement in the different murders and they even offered to lead the police to where the bodies would be buried. Brooks, however, he tried to say that he didn't actively participate in any of the murders. Of course not. Of course not. Now, within just a week, investigators had found 17 bodies that were buried in makeshift graves and also in the boathouse. Another 10 bodies would be found on High Island Beach and also in the woods near Lake Sam Rayburn. The remains of the 28th victim would not be found until 1983. And the definitive number of the amount of victims that Corll actually had remains unknown because it is thought that he did commit quite a lot of killings on his own as well, but we just know of the 28 that involved Henley, Brooks and Corll. Now, Elmer Wayne Henley, he would be convicted of 6 murders and he would be given 6 life sentences for his involvement in the crimes. Like, I mean, give him 28 life sentences just so every single victim has justice, but I mean, I'll take it that he'll be in prison for life. Now, Brooks, he was only convicted of 1 murder and received 1 life sentence. I don't know how they worked that out there, that he only did 1 and then Henley did 6, but again, at least it's life sentences. Wish it was a death penalty, but it wasn't. Now, both Henley and Brooks, they're described as serial killers, as well as Dean Corll. And let's be honest, they are serial killers. Okay, they might have started off as unwilling participants, okay, but over time, each of them enjoyed it. Each of them enjoyed the killing factor. They were sadistic, they gained pleasure from it. So yeah, they should be named as serial killers in the Houston mass murders. Now, Henley in particular, he remains a very controversial name to this very day. Now, he created his own Facebook page to promote his artwork from in prison. What is it with like every murderer turning into an artist? It's like murderer turned artist. I don't know how it happens, but there seems to be a correlation because it's given John Wayne Gacy again and many others. And also, why is this guy on Facebook? Why has he got access to Facebook? This real... What? Now, Henley has also done loads of interviews regarding Dean Corll, the Candyman killer, and in one of these interviews he states that his only regret is that Dean Corll isn't here now, so he could tell Dean Corll just what a good job he had done killing him. Now, David Brooks, on the other hand, he led quite a quiet and private life within prison. He chose not to really correspond or interact with Henley very much, despite Henley trying his best to like get in contact with his old friend. But David Brooks, he actually passed away in prison in 2020 from COVID-19, and that thing that, you know, we're not allowed to say. Like, I'm not mad at that, but you know, these people, they should be tortured and killed in the way that they take their victims. I wholeheartedly believe that. It might be quite controversial, my opinion on Henley and Brooks, but I believe that they are just as culpable. And I know, like, this is where it gets hard, because I know that Brooks was initially groomed. I get that, and I know that in that situation, someone that's been groomed by an abuser, it is very, very difficult to get out of that situation. I know. But we need to remember that Brooks did go away for a period of time. He had the opportunity to walk away, and he did at one point. But it's too late. And he also, when he did walk away, he had no intention of actually dropping the hammer on Corll or Henley. So, I'm sorry. It's so controversial to say, but I think they're just as culpable. But I really want to know what you think on that, because I feel like that's really going to be like mixed opinions. But I just think if you can murder and enjoy it, then you are a cold-hearted murderer. But that is the end of another true crime and makeup video. I really do hope you found this one interesting. Again, I know there was a lot of names and dates thrown at you, but it's so important for me to ensure that every victim gets the coverage that they deserve. And I am just going to put up as many photos of the victims as I can right now, just so we have faces to the names. As always, please just keep these victims in your thoughts, your prayers, and their families, because what they have all suffered and what they have all gone through is just beyond belief. It is the epitome of evil, and no one should suffer in that way. These were young boys with their whole life ahead of them that just were robbed of that chance. So please keep them in your prayers, keep them in your thoughts, remember their names, remember their faces, and let's help keep their memory alive. Please, if you do enjoy my videos, don't forget to subscribe, put the notification bell on so you don't miss when I upload. It would mean the entire world to me. If you can also engage with this video in some way, a like, a comment, a share, all three would be absolutely amazing if you could. Down below in the description you will find a link to all of the products used on my face today. You'll also find my email address where you can send your case suggestions of what you'd like me to cover, or you can leave them in the comments if you would prefer. They all just get added to a big list and I work my way through them. My social media handles will also be linked down below, my Instagram and TikTok, which I am trying to post on more regularly from this month onward, so please look out for that. But that is it for today. Please be a good person, do not be a bad person, stay safe, look after each other, and I will see you in the next one. Bye!